Montana Territory, early spring, 1874. The wind carried the smell of wet pine and melting snow when Sheriff Silas Overton found the little boy huddled beneath the broken wagon. The child could not have been more than 5, his face streaked with mud and tears. Silas crouched, pushing back his hat with a gloved hand. "What's your name, son?" he asked gently. The boy looked up, lips trembling. "Samuel." Silas scanned the wreckage, shattered spokes, torn canvas, and no one else alive in sight. Beside the wagon, 2 bodies lay still under a dusting of snow. A man and a woman, parents most likely. He glanced back at the boy. "You got any family?" Samuel shook his head. Silas's jaw tightened. He stood, lifting the boy into his arms. "You do now." The sun was low when Silas rode into Elkhorn Ridge, the boy asleep against his chest. The town was small, tucked between the mountains, with just enough folk to keep a saloon, a church, and a one-room schoolhouse running. He brought Samuel straight to the boarding house, not the jail. "Miss Clara," he said, knocking on the side door near the kitchen, "I need your help." Clara Bennett opened the door, apron dusted with flour, curls pinned back in the usual neat way. She blinked when she saw the child. "Lord above," she whispered. "Come in." She cleared the table and laid a quilt on the parlor settee. Silas settled Samuel down, brushing a hand over the boy's hair before stepping back. Clara looked at him, eyes dark with worry. "Where did you find him?" "North of Bitterroot Pass." "Wagon was torn up." "Parents didn't make it." She put a hand to her mouth, then pulled it away. "Is he hurt?" "No, just lost." Clara knelt beside the couch, tucking the quilt around the boy with a care that made something in Silas's chest tighten. She had always been gentle like that. Always made things feel steady, even when they were not. "I will keep him here tonight," she said. "He should not wake up alone." Silas nodded. "Thank you." She stood and turned toward him. "You are not planning to send him away, are you?" "No," her brow lifted. "You mean to raise him?" Silas gave a single nod. "I will do right by him." Clara looked at him for a moment too long, then she nodded too. "Then I will help." Silas had known Clara since they were children. She had grown up on the other side of the valley, back when there were more log cabins than fences. He remembered the first time he saw her barefoot near the creek, hair full of wildflowers, laughing like she did not know sorrow yet. Life had changed that. She had buried her parents within 2 winters of each other, then stayed on to run the boarding house alone. Never married, though half the men in Elkhorn had tried. Silas had tried once too, but he had not said it plain and she had not waited. Now he watched her move through the kitchen, boiling water for tea, checking on the boy. Her hands moved with purpose, calm and sure. "She is sleeping," she said, coming to stand beside him. She gave him a small smile. "Samuel told me he has a sister," said her name is Sarah. "She was with him. She ran, he does not know where." Silas's breath caught. "She is still out there," Clara nodded. "He said they got separated when the wagon tipped." Without another word, Silas turned back toward the door. He searched through the night, lantern swinging from his saddle horn. Snow fell again near dawn, light and silent. It was near the creek, just below the ridge, that he saw a small figure curled under a pine. She was barely breathing, her dress torn, feet bare and blue from cold. Silas dismounted and wrapped her in his coat, holding her close as his horse turned back toward town. She did not wake until they reached the boarding house. Clara opened the door before he knocked. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, taking the girl from his arms. Sarah was fevered, lips cracked, cheeks flushed too red. Clara carried her to the guest room and Silas followed, standing useless while Clara worked removing damp clothes, warming water, mixing willow bark into tea. "She will be all right," he asked quietly. Clara glanced back. "I will not let her go." The girl slept for 2 days. Silas stayed close, doing rounds with one eye on the boarding house. Samuel clung to Clara like he had known her forever. Silas watched them from the porch one afternoon, the boy curled in her lap while she read from a tattered book. "You are good with them," he said when he stepped inside. Clara looked up, her expression soft. "They have been through enough." "So have you," he said. She looked down at her hands. "I do not mind helping, I know, but this is more than helping." She met his eyes then. You are not alone in this, Silas. You never have to be. He felt the weight of her words settle into something solid inside his chest. By the end of the week, Sarah was walking around the house, quiet but smiling. She followed Clara more than Samuel now. Silas came by every morning and stayed for supper most nights. He built a cradle for Sarah and carved a wooden horse for Samuel. He did not say it out loud, but everyone in town knew what was happening. One evening, after the children were asleep, Clara walked him out to the porch. "You are staying longer these days," she said. He looked at her. "I want to," she nodded, eyes on the stars. "Do you remember the summer we went up to the lake? You were 17, I was 15. We found that old rowboat," he said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You said you would marry me if I rowed us across. You never did. I never asked again. You do not have to." Silas turned toward her fully. "I want to." Clara's breath caught. "You mean it?" "I do. I want you, Clara. I want this, all of it. You, the children, the quiet mornings, the long nights." She stepped into him, resting her hands on his chest. "Then ask me." He leaned down, his voice low. "Marry me, Clara Bennett." "Yes," she whispered, eyes shining. He kissed her then, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that carried every year they had waited, every moment they had almost said what they felt. Inside the house, Samuel stirred in his bed, and Sarah murmured her brother's name in her sleep. But on the porch, beneath the stars and the first hint of spring, Silas and Clara stood wrapped in something finally whole, and their story had just begun. The morning Clara pinned her shawl and walked to the post office. The wind was sharp enough to sting, though the thaw had begun. She caught the scent of damp earth rising from where the snow had pulled back along the boardwalk. Inside, the air was dry with paper and ink, and the postmaster, Mr. Tilby, was sorting letters with a tremor in his hand that had grown worse since the year before. He looked up and nodded. "Something come for you, Miss Bennett, from Denver." Clara took the envelope and stepped out without opening it. She stood for a moment in the weak sun, fingers resting against the seal. When she finally tore it open, her eyes swept the page once, then again without blinking. She folded it tight and slipped it into her pocket. Later that day, she found Silas at the edge of town, where he was hammering fence posts with Tom Coulter to mend the paddock behind the livery. She waited until he straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the side of his wrist. "I need to speak with you," she said. Silas handed the mallet to Tom and followed her toward the grove behind the schoolhouse, where it was quiet and the air still smelled faintly of cedar smoke. "There was a letter waiting," she said, drawing it from her pocket. "It was addressed to a Mrs. Clara Overton." Silas frowned. "That's not your name." "No, it isn't." She unfolded the letter carefully and held it out to him. He read it slowly, lips moving with the words. "I don't understand," he said after a moment. "This is from a Reverend Wilcox." She nodded. He arranged a match. A mail-order bride. She was supposed to arrive in Overton's Gulch, Nevada, but the directions were wrong. The rider who brought her in said only Overton, and the station master sent her here, to Elkhorn Ridge. Silas's brow furrowed. "You, no," she said softly. "Her name is Margaret Hensley. She's due on next week's stage." Silas folded the letter again, slower this time. "And the groom, Deputy Nathaniel Ward, the Reverend said he's been stationed there 6 years. Lost his wife to fever." He stared past her a long moment, like he could see the hills stretching south through the pass. "Does she know she's headed to the wrong place?" Clara shook her head. "Not unless she's received another letter." He let out a breath. "I reckon we'll be waiting at the station." The day Margaret arrived, the stage came in late, dust trailing behind the wheels like fog. Clara watched from the edge of the platform, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Silas stood beside her, his hat low over his eyes, coat buttoned to the throat. The children were at the boarding house with old Mrs. Redley, who'd offered to keep them for the afternoon. When the stage stopped, the driver stepped down and opened the door. A small woman emerged, no older than Clara herself, with a valise in one hand and a folded paper clutched in the other. Her coat was worn thin at the collar and her boots were scuffed from travel, but her back was straight and her chin high. She looked around, confused, then spotted the name painted on the depot wall. Her lips parted. "This isn't Overton's Gulch," Clara came forward slowly. "No, ma'am, you've come to Elkhorn Ridge." Margaret looked at her, then at Silas. "But I was meant to meet a Deputy Ward." "Nathaniel Ward." "You were," Silas said gently, but the letter was misrouted. For a moment, Margaret's shoulders sagged just slightly, then she straightened again. "Is Deputy Ward not here? He's in Nevada," Clara said. "Almost 200 miles south." Margaret seemed to fold inwards, the way a leaf does when the frost comes early. "I've come so far," she whispered. "There's nothing left for me back east. My brother's gone to the mines, my aunt remarried and moved to Missouri. I have no letters left to send." Silas glanced at Clara, then stepped forward. "You've got a place to stay. We'll see you fed and warm. You don't have to decide anything now." Margaret looked between them. "You're not sending me back." "No one's sending you anywhere," Clara said. "Let's get you inside." That first night, Margaret barely spoke over supper. She ate slowly, listening to the children chatter, her eyes lingering on Sarah when she reached for Clara's hand without thinking. Later, when Clara helped her settle in the upstairs room, Margaret stood at the window a long time, watching the snow fall in quiet drifts along the eaves. Clara turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped her. "Do you love him?" Clara looked back. "Yes," Margaret nodded. "It shows." "I hope I find something like that." "You will," Clara said. "Not all things arrive when or how we expect, but they come." Downstairs, Silas was stirring the fire. He looked up when Clara stepped into the parlor and set her sewing basket beside the rocker. "She'll be all right, in time." He reached for her hand without speaking. She let him hold it, her palm warm against his. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside the boarding house, the lamplight glowed soft against the windows, and for the first time in a long while, every room was full. Margaret woke to the sound of wood being chopped. The rhythm of it carried through the walls, steady, deliberate. She sat up slowly, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. The room was warmer than the night before, a small iron stove nestled in the corner pulsing with low heat. She dressed by the window, fingers stiff from cold, and watched as the man outside split logs cleanly down the center. His coat was heavy, collar turned up, but she could tell it was Silas by the way he moved, measured, restrained, like someone who never forgot what he carried. Downstairs, the scent of cornmeal and salt pork drifted through the hall. Clara was at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair damp at the nape. The children sat at the table, Sarah tracing the lines of a biscuit with her fingertip while Samuel tried to balance a spoon on his nose. Margaret hesitated in the doorway. Clara looked up. "There's coffee if you want it." Margaret stepped in, her boots quiet on the worn floorboards. "I can help." Clara handed her a tin plate. "You can sit." She did. The chair creaked beneath her, the kind of sound that belonged to a house that had survived too many winters. She ate slowly, watching the children, the way they leaned toward Clara without realizing the ease of it. When Silas came in, he dusted snow from his sleeves and nodded toward Margaret. "Morning," she met his eyes. "Thank you for yesterday." He set the logs near the hearth. "You'd have done the same." "I'm not sure I would have known how." He looked at her then, not unkindly. "You would have figured it out." Later, Clara took the children to the schoolhouse. Margaret remained behind, hands curled around a cup of lukewarm coffee. Silas lingered by the door. "You need a place to start," he said. "I suppose I do." "There's a widow near the river needs help spinning wool. She's near blind now, pays in coin and eggs." Margaret looked up. "You think I'd manage it?" "I don't think you'd break." She stood. "Show me the way." Silas saddled the mule while Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter. The wind had shifted again, carrying the sting of wet bark and thawing rot. They walked in silence for a long stretch, the mule's hooves muffled in the patchy snow. The widow's cabin sat hunched between two cottonwoods, smoke rising from a crooked chimney. Silas stayed back while Margaret knocked. The door opened, and a thin voice called her inside. By the time she came out again, her cheeks were flushed with wind and something else she hadn't felt since before the train left Kansas City usefulness. "She wants me back tomorrow," she said. Silas nodded once. "Figured she would." The walk back was slower. Margaret kept her eyes on the trees where birds darted in and out of the bare branches. She spoke without turning. "Did you ever lose someone?" He didn't answer right away. The air between them settled heavy. "My brother Levi. He was 22. "How?" "Shot breaking up a fight in the canyon." She looked at him then. "Was he like you?" "No," he said. "He was better." They walked the rest of the way without speaking. That evening, Margaret peeled potatoes while Clara read aloud from a weathered book by lamplight. The children sat close, heads tilted, their eyes growing heavy with each page. Silas carved a length of pine into something small and square by the fire, his knife moving slow and careful. When the children were tucked in, Margaret helped Clara wash the dishes. Her hands were pink from the cold water, but she didn't complain. Clara handed her a towel. "You're good with them. I wasn't sure I would be. You're not the same woman who stepped off that stage." Margaret looked down at the plate in her hands. "I don't know who I am yet. You'll find her." Silas walked her to her room before turning in. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the fire behind them. "I'll walk you to the widow's in the morning," he said. "I can find my way. I know." She paused with her hand on the doorframe. "You don't speak much. No need to most days. I think I'd like to hear more." He looked at her then, something unreadable in his expression. "You will." She closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a breath longer than needed. Outside, the wind stirred the shutters. Inside, the quiet wasn't empty, it held the shape of something beginning. By the time the creek began to run clean again, Margaret had taken to walking the mile to the widow's cabin without escort. The mule stayed tied near the porch as she worked, her skirts brushed with wool lint, and her palms calloused from days spent carding and spinning. The widow, Mrs. Evangeline Hobb, had once kept a house of her own in Helena, but the years had narrowed her world to a single room and the sound of her own voice. Margaret listened more than she spoke, hands busy while stories unfolded between them like thread from the spindle. One afternoon, as she walked back alone beneath a sky bruised with early dusk, she saw Silas standing near the edge of the churchyard, a shovel in hand, dirt clinging to the cuffs of his trousers. He didn't wave or call out, just waited until she reached him. "Wasn't expecting you here," she said. He leaned the shovel against the fence. "Old man Pritchard passed in his sleep, no kin to speak of, figured I'd see to the grave myself." Margaret looked at the fresh mound, no marker yet, just a wooden stake and a length of twine nailed across the top. "Seems like he deserved a name," she said. Silas nodded. "I'll carve one tonight." They stood in silence until the wind made Margaret shift her shawl higher over her shoulders. Silas reached into his coat and handed her a folded cloth parcel. "Mrs. Redley sent you this. Said you've been skipping supper." Margaret took it, surprised by the heat still clinging to the linen. "I didn't mean to. You forget yourself when you're working," he said. "That's not always bad, but it's not always good either." She looked at him closely then. "You sound like someone who knows." "I've done my share of forgetting." She unwrapped the parcel, still warm cornbread and a slice of smoked ham. She tore off a piece and handed it to him without speaking. He took it, and they ate together there beside the grave, the quiet broken only by the creaking of the church sign against its post. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, "about staying." Silas didn't respond right away. He looked toward the half-frozen creek below the ridge, then back at her. "What would staying look like? I'm not sure yet. It wouldn't be the life I came for, but that life doesn't seem to be waiting anywhere." He studied her face, the wind tugging at the loose strands of her hair. "You wouldn't be unwanted, I know." She said it plainly, without hesitation, not with false modesty or hope, just the truth laid bare. Later that week, Clara brought Margaret a wrapped bundle of dyed wool. "For your own spinning," she said. "Mrs. Hobb says you're ready." Margaret turned the bundle in her hands. "I thought she didn't believe in generosity." "She said you earned it." Margaret smiled, a small lift at the corner of her mouth that hadn't existed when she'd first stepped off the stage. "I suppose I did." That night, as Margaret sat by the fire with her spindle, Sarah climbed into her lap without asking. Margaret hesitated, wool paused between her fingers, then she wrapped an arm around the girl's waist and kept spinning. Silas watched from the doorway, his coat damp from the sleet outside. Clara, seated across from him, kept her eyes on her mending but spoke low. "You're watching her like a man who's already decided." "I haven't said anything," he answered. "You don't need to." He rubbed at the back of his neck. "She lost everything." "So did you," Clara said, threading her needle. "She's not a thing to save, Silas. She's a woman learning how to stand. I know that." "Then don't rush her." "I wouldn't." Across the room, Margaret looked up, noticing their silence. Clara gave her a smile that meant nothing and everything at once, and Margaret returned it with a nod. When the fire burned low and the children were tucked away, Margaret lingered near the hearth, packing her wool carefully into the basket. "I've been offered a place with Mrs. Hobb," she said. "A room of my own. She'd like me to stay on longer." Silas stood, arms crossed over his chest, the firelight catching on the worn buttons of his coat. "Do you want to take it?" "I think I do. I think I need to." He nodded once. No protest, no hesitation. "I'll walk you there in the morning," he said. "I'd like that." As she stepped past him toward the stairs, he reached out, not to stop her, just to touch the edge of her sleeve with his fingers. "You're not leaving," he said. She held his gaze. "I'm just finding where I fit." He let her go. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked beneath her steps. And down below, Silas turned back to the fire, the room quieter than it had been all winter. The snow had fully receded by April, leaving behind rutted roads and the sharp green of new shoots pushing up along the creek banks. Margaret's days with Mrs. Hobb had grown into a quiet routine: mornings carding wool, afternoons weaving beneath the lean-to, while the old woman dozed with her feet wrapped in quilts. The work was steady, the pay enough for bread, and Margaret's hands bore the faint scent of lanolin that didn't wash out entirely, no matter how hot the water. When Clara came one afternoon with Sarah holding a basket of eggs and early dandelion greens, she lingered longer than usual. They sat on the porch while the wind lifted the edge of their skirts and made the old wind chime above the door clatter gently. "She's been asking if she can come back to the boarding house on Sundays," Clara said, brushing Sarah's hair from her face. "She says you tell better stories." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I only tell the ones I needed to hear once." Clara smiled, but her eyes didn't drift from her daughter. "You've given her a kind of steadiness I didn't know how to teach." "I think she just needed to see someone choosing to stay." Clara nodded, her thumb running over the split handle of the basket. "Silas asked if I thought he should come visit." Margaret looked toward the trees where the leaves were just beginning to unfurl. "He doesn't need to ask your permission." "No," Clara agreed, "but he still does." When Silas arrived the following week, he didn't bring flowers or a gift. He brought a repaired kettle for Mrs. Hobb and a pair of gloves Margaret had mentioned losing to the wind back in March. He didn't hand them to her, just set them on the porch rail and sat down beside the spinning wheel. "You've gotten faster," he said. Margaret adjusted her foot on the treadle. "I've had time." He rested his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding where you fit." She didn't stop spinning. "And I don't think a person fits in a place, I think they fit beside someone." She let the wheel slow. "That used to scare me, I know. But it doesn't anymore." His voice was steady, quiet enough that the breeze nearly carried it off. "Then come back with me." Margaret studied his face. There was no urgency there, no pleading, only a man who had waited long enough to know what mattered. "I'd need to keep spinning," she said. "I've got orders now. Folks are expecting blankets by May. We can build you a shed behind the boarding house, south-facing wall for light. I'd want to keep my earnings. They'll be yours." She smiled then, a soft curve that caught him off guard. "I'd want to keep the gloves too." He took her hand. "You can keep everything." The wedding was quiet, held in the church where Pritchard had been buried, with wild violets placed along the windows and Samuel standing stiff in a too-large jacket. Sarah picked at her hem the whole time, but she smiled when Clara finished tying the blue ribbon in Margaret's hair. That evening, they returned to the boarding house without ceremony. Clara had made a stew and baked a pie, and the children fell asleep early after too much excitement and a walk along the ridge. Margaret stood in the doorway of what used to be the guest room, now freshly painted with a braided rug across the floor and her spindle hanging from the wall. Silas leaned against the doorframe. "It's yours." "I know," she said and stepped into him. He wrapped his arms around her, the way she'd imagined once on cold nights when the wind had no mercy. Now it was warm inside. The windows held the last of the sunset, and somewhere downstairs, a kettle began to whistle. Margaret felt the shape of her life settle into place, not like something she'd stumbled into, but something she'd chosen. Carefully, slowly, like spinning raw wool into something strong enough to last. Years passed, as they tend to. The children grew. Samuel took over the smithy when old John Coulter passed, and Sarah began teaching letters in the schoolhouse by the time she was 16. Clara stayed in town, never far, always with her hands in bread dough or wrapped around a child's shoulder. Margaret's shed behind the boarding house grew into a full shop. Women came from as far as Helena for her weavings, not just because they were warm, but because they were made by a woman who had learned how to stay and how to be loved without being saved. On warm evenings, she and Silas sat on the back porch, her spinning basket beside her chair, his hand wrapped around hers. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their life had been built one season at a time, one quiet choice after another, and it held.